Hi everybody, thanks so much for joining us. My name is Bronwyn Edwards from Roses in the Ocean, CEO and also a member of the co-facilitation team. And with me today is...
James, also facilitator at Roses in the Ocean and the other co-facilitator of the design. So thank you, Bronnie.
So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge all the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today, and to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge those with a lived experience of suicide, particularly those who've taken part in this co-design process, and for those who are in the community, in the Redcliffe community area for whom this service is being designed. So thank you all for all of your wisdom and insights to the process so far. So today, James and I are going to share with you what has come out from the final session, which was a combined session last week with people with a lived experience of suicide and other stakeholders, including health professionals. So we'll just share screen with you now, and we will take you through all that we heard. So just to orientate you to where we are in this co-design process for the Redcliffe catchment area, we have completed all of the actual face-to-face sessions now. So the lived experience focus groups, the group sessions, we've had 3 feedback loops so far. And then, as I said, we've just had the combined session. So this is feedback loop number 3. And at the conclusion of this webinar, the recording of this as well as the survey will be made available. We really encourage you all to please go in and do that survey. Please circulate the link to the webinar and the survey as far and wide as you can within the Redcliffe community. And then we will be eagerly awaiting all of those responses, and they will be themed and analysed and drawn into the rest of the outputs from this process, and then provided into a report to the Primary Health Network. Now, just to remind everyone also in terms of the guidance and principles that have guided this co-design process. So we know that the site will operate outside of normal business hours, and that the PHN seeks to understand the days and times that the service should operate and why. In terms of guiding principles from the Primary Health Network, the Safe Space Hub is a peer-led alternative to a hospital emergency departments for those experiencing emotional distress and suicidal crisis. The Safe Space Hub will adopt appropriate use of peer workforces, offer access to clinical support, including on-call supports to ensure a warm and welcoming space and service where guests are supported. And the Safe Space Hub will take a no wrong door approach and seek to provide connections to services and the community. I'll hand over to you, James.
Pardon me. So having a look at the values themselves. So the conversations that we had, in particular, how we guide this safe space. 6 ones that you can see there: authenticity, a sense of inclusivity and validation or validating, kindness, safety, respect, and open-mindedness. And so to say that those aren't prioritised in any order, but those certainly have been a set of values that we work through with a number of the conversations that come down to the 6 most important ones. Thank you.
So the vast majority of the combined session was spent workshopping a range of scenarios. So James and I are just going to talk you through what these scenarios were, and then the responses that we heard at the combined session. So the first scenario was about Chantel, a 17-year-old teenage girl who arrives at the safe space experiencing suicidal thoughts. It's the first time she's ever reached out for help, and she's really frightened by what she's experiencing. She doesn't know where else to go. It is 8 p.m, which in this scenario is just 30 minutes before closing time. Now, the purpose of this scenario is to determine how people aged under 18 will be supported when seeking help through the Safe Space Hub, and to determine how the local Safe Space Hub will manage supporting guests within organisational constraints such as limited opening hours, and also to determine what the scope and nature of support is to guests beyond the direct support within the Safe Space Hub. So what we heard was In terms of supporting young people, that it's really important that the safe space doesn't look and feel clinical. Maybe the art on the wall may be made by other young people in the space. It's a really powerful signal that young people are valued and welcome. Need to understand how child safety legislation and requirements around informed consent applies. The differences in what young people from ages need. So supporting a 17-year-old would be very different from supporting a 14-year-old, and the service model will need to reflect that. Peer workers would be aiming to understand who supports this Chantel in this case, who she lives with, who can they link her in with to be safe for the night. If possible, transport home would be a helpful aspect of support, ensuring that 2 workers were available to travel with Chantel. And to ensure that follow-up phone calls the day after Chantel attends the safe space, noting the importance of this first time seeking help, and that there may require multiple follow-up calls. When asked to really consider supporting guests near closing time, the suggestion to roster staff on for 2 hours either side of opening and closing time to provide a buffer. The 2 hours prior could enable follow-up phone calls to guests who had been in the day or the night before, and the 2 hours after closing for completing paperwork and supporting people who stay beyond closing time to plan onward connection. Peer workers need a consistent process to offer Chantel the most critical safety elements, so phone numbers for relevant services, recognising that information packs may not actually get looked at. A no wrong door approach should include closing time. Considerations for how staff can help someone who comes to the door after closing time. Ensure that peer workers are paid for their time if they have to stay later. Ensure 2 workers stay on for safety reasons. And if the person is still in distress after closing time, you may need to call an ambulance and go with Chantel to the hospital or bring them to the hospital. Ideal for agreed process between safe space and ED, where the person can be admitted quickly when needed without needing to wait in ED following a connection from the safe space.
Thanks, Bonnie. And it's really important that we recognise that these scenarios allow the co-design people to have a look at this and say, well, are there anything additional or different that we might like to add? And that's why we really encourage you to look at what's been shared so far, and particularly at the end of this webinar and through the survey, add any further comments. So let's go through scenario 2, because there are 6 scenarios that we're walking through. So here we go. Leanne walks into the Safe Space Hub. They know the Safe Space well, having visited for a few weeks in a row. They've previously told a peer worker it's a place where they can relax for a while, knowing that they are safe from self-harming while they're there. Tonight, they appear to be intoxicated and is quite agitated that the peer worker, who they now feel they can trust, isn't available to talk with them. They're becoming quite loud and insistent, and another guest has indicated this is making them feel uncomfortable. So from the conversations, what we heard was, Ronnie will quickly flip to that next slide. Essentially, the purpose of this scenario is to get a sense of gotten a sense of determining how the Safe Space Hub will work with guests who appear to be intoxicated, and how the Safe Space Hub will work with guests those whose distress may express itself as aggression, and finally explore ways that the peer workers will manage the competing needs of the guests. So the conversation was centred around supporting Leanne in terms of that she knows the space well, and to ask about her preferences for where to be, what she needs, be led by them, and how the safe space can be best met their needs. The idea of asking Leanne how a previous peer worker was helpful and get a sense of what that was. Allowing the staff to have guidelines and pathways to follow if strategies aren't working to engage and or support Leanne. Peer workers to have the skills and strategies suggesting calming and slowing Leanne down. Could include redirection and distraction, comfortable chair, tea, coffee, some sensory items, a worker modelling a slower pace. Avoid what doesn't work in the ED. Lots of questions, fast pace, high energy, overwhelmed with information. Maybe even going outside to meet and talk with Leanne, able to express agitation by walking and moving around. Consider utility of a list of expectations for people being in a safe space may be appropriate. Not to refer to when someone is agitated, but for people who may attend regularly become familiar with. And finally, in terms of being able to support Leanne, recognise that questions about what brought Leanne to the safe space may not be helpful in this moment, yet to work in the here and now with focus on what Leanne needs to be safe and supported. So in terms of responding to this scenario, managing competing needs and safety of guests, so to consider that the guests who may be feeling uncomfortable, including those who don't explicitly express this, it's not possible to manage the situation if single staff would need 2 or 3 working together to manage this scenario. Teamwork of staff working together manage the scenario by supporting Leanne and supporting the person who might be uncomfortable in the safe space. And the physical space configured in a way where a guest could go if feeling uncomfortable. Try to keep the guests in different areas if expressing a need for space from other guests. Thanks, Bonnie.
Scenario 3 was about a young man who has been connected to the safe space from a multicultural services organisation who arrives at the Safe Space Hub. He is accompanied by a lady of similar age who he doesn't introduce. He appears a little agitated with the woman, but seems happy to have arrived at the safe space. He accepts a cup of tea for one of the staff, and while he's chatting quietly with them, he keeps glancing towards the woman. It's discovered she is his sister and is really keen to stay with him in a safe space and is clearly very concerned about her brother. The purpose of this scenario was to determine how the safe space will meet the young man's needs, determine the Safe Space Hub's approach to supporting carers or natural supports of people in crisis, and determine how to identify and honour the wishes of the guest regarding the role of their carers or natural support in their crisis. Determine what other potential supports could be offered to carers and natural supports. The discussion around supporting guests who come in with a carer centred around speaking with the guests separately to ensure their voice is heard, avoid assumptions around the nature of the relationship's dynamic. Guests may not feel comfortable sharing information in front of their carer or support person for many reasons. For example, one peer worker goes with the guest to have a conversation in a private space or a room, while another peer worker gets a carer a cup of tea and coffee. Separating the guest from the carer may also cause added distress, so aim to bring them back together if the guest is okay with the carer being there. Supporting carers in the Safe Space Hub, acknowledge that carers are also guests of the space, ask what they want, offer refreshments and make them comfortable. Enable the carer to stay close to loved one while also having some space for own rest and reflection. Address needs identified for the carer, acknowledging the limited external supports that are available. Offer information about carer groups, other services, information, resources, packs. Added diversity in staff backgrounds with lived experience of caring for someone, and always led by the person and their needs. In terms of supporting guests in a culturally appropriate way, some suggestions: having items or art of cultural significance within the space, researching the area and engaging with local community leaders to understand and ensure culture is represented within the space to help people feel comfortable and welcome. Connect with multicultural organisations with peer workers with a lived experience, for example, the World Wellness Group. Peer match to the best of ability where possible to meet cultural needs. Have access to external interpreters to meet language needs, and a base level of training for all working space staff or volunteers to understand mental health and wellbeing for people from diverse backgrounds.
Scenario 4, thanks, Bonnie. David turns up the Safe Space Hub for the first time. He seems quite agitated and distracted. He had heard about the safe space from a community services worker who supports him in a program for people with complex and enduring mental illness. He tells a peer worker that his neighbour is trying to control his thoughts through a chip he has planted in his television. David says he can't handle the torment of this anymore, and he feels like that killing himself is the only way to get relief from it. So the purpose behind this is to determine how the safe space approaches the support of guests who have been identified as having a serious mental illness, and determine how the safe space supports guests who identify as experiencing suicidal distress as a direct result of what clinicians would understand as symptoms associated with psychosis. Finally, to determine what the non-clinical support looks like in the context of supporting guests with a diagnosis of serious mental illness. So what we heard from this scenario in terms of supporting guests in distress is the aim of the safe space in suicide prevention and to provide support around emotional distress. A focus on peer workers is working in the moment and keeping David safe, not treating mental illness. To recognise that David's mental illness is a trigger for suicidality, like anyone else who presents to the safe space with those thoughts and emotion. Peer worker to connect with David to allow him to talk freely, listen to him, and provide a safe and secure environment. The acknowledgement and validation experience he is having without judging what he is experiencing. The idea of avoid trying to find solutions to the problem and taking a therapeutic and/or clinical approach. Offering sensory options upon arrival, showing David the space, introducing what's available without an overload and redirecting the focus. And of course, being mindful about the environment within the space, recognise possible triggers and to try and minimise these. So in terms of the peer workers, with a lived experience does not mean a lack of experience or skills to work with David in this scenario. Peer worker could eventually have conversation about what other supports David has in place and how they're going, such as medication, but not right away, may not want to disclose this at all. The initial priority to build rapport, understanding, validate emotions, then gauge the timing and appropriateness of other supports if deemed necessary. And ask David's permission to let caseworker know that he's come into the space and what they've talked about, ensuring that these are not perceived as being sent back to the source.
Scenario 5. Amanda is a 20-year-old woman with a history of past suicide attempts who comes to the safe space extremely distressed. She says that her life is not worth living, that she's tried everything to stop feeling this way. She tells the peer worker that she has been on dozens of different medications, tried therapy for childhood trauma, done everything the psychologist told her. Nothing ever works, she says, and she has run out of options. When the worker asks if she has plans to kill herself, she tells them that she has the means and is just waiting for her mum and dad to leave her alone. Her history of previous attempts is known to one of the safe space peer workers who had previously supported her in ED. The purpose of this scenario is to determine how the local safe space will respond to guests who are characterised as at imminent risk of suicide, and to determine how peer workers will support guests who are highly suicidal to ensure their safety, and also to determine what peer workers will need in order to support guests who are highly suicidal in an effective way. With regards to supporting guests at imminent risks, peer worker to welcome Amanda upon entry and stay with her, offer reassurance and hope, sharing lived experience. Thank Amanda for coming in, recognise courage and that she did the right thing. Building trust, noting that Amanda may disclose more about her experiences or current situation more as trust is built with the peer worker. Using peer work skills to calm through sensory activities, trying a range of different things. If Amanda's other supports are not the right fit for her, suggest what else she might consider. If a peer worker determines that Amanda may need to go to hospital to stay safe, acknowledge this and provide some control over the process. Explore possible pathway straight to the mental health service, bypassing the ED. At the right time, find where Amanda can go and stay the night where she feels safe, or follow up with Amanda regularly, including if Amanda is admitted to hospital. Peer workers, some considerations for them. Ensure the workforce is well supported. Recognise peer work is hard work and supporting others with distress and trauma can be traumatic. Regular, adequate supervision and debriefing for peer workers to look after themselves, done by a peer worker's supervisors and not a clinician, ideally external to the service. So for other people in the space as well, there was a conversation around the impact that it would have on those people potentially. So there's a need for a mix of private and common areas that other guests are able to connect with and have a conversation, and that peer workers can recognise which guests might need more attention.
Final scenario, we're almost there. Well done, Ronnie. The sixth scenario is where Peter walks into the safe space on a very stormy evening. One of the peer workers rostered on recognises Peter as a local and has seen Peter spend time near the safe space before. Peter is currently experiencing homelessness and says he's considering ending his life. It's 5 p.m. and a safe space has just opened. So the purpose of this scenario is to determine the local safe space and how it will respond to guests who are in distress and might be experiencing homelessness, and also to determine what peer workers will need in order to help people who had not attend the safe space in crisis or emotional distress, who do not have a fixed address. The conversation around this, in particular supporting Peter's distress ideas, came up with to start with a focus on his suicidal thoughts and distress, not his housing situation. Address Peter's immediate need, which is someone to connect with for emotional support and understanding, and provide access in the space for Peter to shower, maybe something to eat. We'll need practical considerations, but likely to be a very strong sensory comforting experience itself. While not likely to have the sleeping furniture available, people who are distressed may want and need to sleep and rest. And understand if Peter has any natural supports they can connect with and get a space, a place for him to stay the night. So supporting the guests who may be homeless, a secondary purpose may be to to contact with other services or supports, acknowledging there's no easy fix to this homelessness scenario. Safe space to have knowledge of the relevant services to connect a guest experiencing homelessness and passing that information on, and peer workers to be knowledgeable around helpful resources, particularly apps for availability, capacity of accommodation and or food vans. And to ensure not too much burden is placed on peer workers to find housing solutions for people, about having a few go-to resources to connect people onto while prioritising their distress. And finally, one of the comments made or suggestions, acknowledging that guests leaving a safe space into homelessness may happen.
So we also had the opportunity to meet with a group of younger people to really discuss whether a youth-specific safe space was something that ought to be being considered for the Redcliffe area. We acknowledge that there's been quite a lot of work done in this area prior to this co-design process. And so when we met with the group, we wanted to understand if it was a safe space for all of community, what would it have to look like, feel like, and offer for younger people to be comfortable going there? And then we also wanted to ask if they felt that there was a need for a youth-specific safe space. So discussion themes around the need for a youth-specific safe space, recognition of a genuine need for a safe space in Redcliffe that meets the needs of young people. A youth-specific safe space could complement the adult-focused safe space opening in Caboolture. So there was conversation around, well, there's going to be one in Caboolture, perhaps the Redcliffe one could be a youth focus and then could be servicing each area. The group agreed that initially safe space established with a no wrong door approach and guests of any age can come in. As part of a 10-year vision, need to explore a dedicated safe space for children and youth. Acknowledge that young people are often supported by a family member who wants to take them somewhere, so support should be family inclusive. And workforce implications for a safe space, inclusive for young people, diversity in age, knowledgeable about issues facing young people.
Let me talk about the prioritising safe space, the non-negotiables. And this is what we heard from you in terms of what were the 5 things that you can't do without in terms of the safe space in Redcliffe. And see there, safety and comfort for all guests and staff, accessible support, transport, location, cultural support, all abilities. Always reflecting and improving this idea of continuous feedback from people using and not using the space, and of course supporting the workers. Peer workers receiving the appropriate support, for example, information, formal debriefing, opportunities for team reflection. And finally, the top 5 non-negotiable is an idea that is non-clinical and have sensory approaches in its support.
All right, so next steps. This particular webinar and survey constitute feedback loop number 3. So the survey will be open, excuse me, until the 11th of November. And the link to the survey and the webinar will be distributed through to everyone who's been involved in the co-design. So please forward that as far and wide as you possibly can. We really look forward to seeing all the responses. So if you've taken part in this process so far. You may have thought of something more since we were all together last, so please go in and add those additional thoughts. And those of you watching this who have not been part of it so far, we really, really welcome and look forward to your views as well. So thank you all so very much, and we look forward to seeing the results of the survey in the next week.
Wonderful.
Thanks
Brian.
everyone. Bye.